say about Dr. Martin Luther King. Most people just know the facts about King. Well, some of the facts they don't even know. His real name was not Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. His real name was Michael King. His father was a Baptist preacher who one day decided to take on the name in honor of the great reformer Martin Luther. So he took on the name Martin Luther King, and then he named his son Martin Luther King Jr. This was never a legal name, by the way. It was never put in the courts or anything. It was just taken. At the age of 15, Dr. Martin Luther King, or Michael King, whichever way you want to look at it, attended the liberal school of Morehouse College in Atlanta. And there he toyed with the idea of becoming a doctor or a lawyer. But he started reading Henry Thoreau, as far as some of the research I've done. Henry Thoreau and his essay on civil disobedience, and he became very fascinated with that. And also he loved Gandhi. He loved the writings of Gandhi. And in 1963, the December 20th National Observer said this. They reported that King was saying that the Bible was full of legends and myths. And he declared that at Morehouse, the shackles of fundamentalism were removed. Now, in one book I read, it pointed out that there's never been any public record or any way that we know that publicly Dr. Martin Luther King ever acknowledged Jesus Christ as the only begotten Son of God, or that he ever repented of his sins or anything like that. No public record of that, they said. In the mid-50s, this man emerged as a great charismatic leader of the black community. And in 1957, he became the head of the new founded organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. How many remember that? Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And of course, April 4th, 1968, he was murdered on the balcony of a hotel or motel in Memphis, Tennessee. Here is another quote by someone who said they called him Martin Loser King. What was this? Another white supremacist? No. It was a Negro congressman by the name of Adam Clayton Powell. And he was calling him that because Martin Luther King, as he said it, was always supposedly promoting peace, but always had the riots following him, etc. Now, I pointed out to you that Helms had the 6,500 pages of information from the FBI. That's not all the information that the FBI have on this man. They have 14 file cabinets in regards to Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, I'll tell you something. In all fairness to Dr. Martin Luther King, understand that the FBI of this country aren't lily white themselves. Ooh, scratch that out. That won't go on the radio, I'll guarantee you. That the FBI themselves are not all that clean. Some people call them bot police today. But besides that, you know, we've got our hands full here. We won't talk about the FBI.
That's about it, really. Young mountain bee blowing snow, but nothing you can't handle.
The FBI had the 14 file cabinets full, but these files were sealed by a federal judge, and they can't be looked at until the year 2027. They seal them. Now, isn't that interesting? Remember, all these so-called great promoters of truth and free speech, we call them reporters, you know, you'd think they'd be crying like gut-shot panthers about this, you know. People have a right to know. You know, after all, they thought we had the right to know. They hear every profanity that Nixon ever uttered. But you didn't hear a word from the media, did you? They weren't screaming. Nobody's complaining about the files being sealed up until 2027. Turn over to the Gospel of John. Correction, 1 John, the 3rd chapter. 1 John, the 3rd chapter. And notice with me verse 19 and 20. Let's make that a correction. Let's turn to the Gospel of John, I hope. The Gospel of John, the 3rd chapter, verse 19 and 20. Seems like these two scriptures are very fitting in light of the fact that the feds have decided we shouldn't see the files in regards to Dr. Martin Luther King. This is what it says, quote, "And this is the judgment, that the light is come into the world, and men love the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light, and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. Men that do evil, it's saying here, don't want the light of investigation, lest their deeds are exposed. Well, there won't be any light shining in those files, those 14 file cabinets, until the year 2027, if we're still around as a nation. A Professor David Garl, who authored the 1981 book entitled The FBI and Martin Luther King Jr., said that the reason the FBI had so much information and thought they were justified in accumulating information on Dr. Martin Luther King and having wiretaps and informants, etc., that it was because of 4 reasons. Quote, embezzlement, employing prostitutes, alienating wives, affections from their husbands, and violation of the Mann Act. In addition, they also pointed out the numerous communist ties. Now, I want you to know, I didn't say that. This man wrote the book, and he's pro Martin Luther King holiday, too, by the way. The communist connection. We must not forget that we were told many times over that the communists were quite involved in the race riots and in the racial issues of the 50s and the 60s. This is what J. Edgar Hoover said in a speech. He said, quote, we do know that communist influence does exist in the Negro movement, and it is this influence which is vitally important. He goes on to say that the Communist Party, quote, strives only to exploit what is often legitimate Negro complaints and grievances for the advancement of communist objectives. Racial incidences are magnified and dramatized by communists in an effort to generate racial tensions, end quote. Again, don't get angry at me. I'm just quoting a man that was once the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He said there's communist connections. Turn over to the first chapter of the book of Psalms. I'm going to show you a picture, but before I do, I thought maybe we ought to read this scripture. The first chapter of the book of Psalms, starting with verse 1. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. I thought I would read that before I showed you this particular picture. It's going to be very difficult to see. But here is a picture from the book entitled Martin Luther King, The Man Behind the Myth, by Des Griffin. And here you have a picture of Martin Luther King at a communist training school. This is what it says underneath the caption. The above picture was taken by an employee of the state of Georgia at the Highlander Folk School during the Labor Day weekend of 1958. The photograph was sent to the Highlander Folk School by the Georgia Commission on Education. The Highlander Folk School was abolished by an act of the legislature of the state of Tennessee at a later date. It was charged with being a subversive organization. Those numbered in the picture are 1. Martin Luther King, 2. Abner W. Berry, a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, 3. Audrey Williams, and 4. Miles Horton, director of Highland Folk School for Communist Training. And yet it says here that the blessed man is the one that does not sit in the seat of the scoffers or walk in the counsel of the wicked. And it seems that we are told continually about the affiliations that Martin Luther King Jr. had with the communist movement. In fact, JFK took a walk in the Rose Garden, it is reported, with Martin Luther King and told him that all of his aides were communist. And it was his brother, Robert Kennedy, who instigated the investigation on Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, the Southern Christian Leadership, what's that? Southern Christian Leadership Conference, right. Just seems you're trying to pay attention there. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was investigated by the Joint Legislative Committee on Un-American Activities for the state of Louisiana, and it concluded in a 3-part report that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, headed by Martin Luther King, was substantially under the control of the Communist Party. That's what they said, quote, substantially under the control of the Communist Party. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was the brainchild of 2 New Yorkers. One, a man by the name of Stanley D. Levison. He was a Jewish lawyer. And another man by the name of Bayard Rustin. Now, Stanley Levison was identified by the FBI as a member of the Executive Committee of the Communist Party, USA. Andrew Young, who was a friend of Dr. Martin Luther King, and also the presidential appointment during the Carter administration to the United Nations, he said that Levison was, quote, one of the closest friends Martin Luther King ever had, end quote. Levison provided the legal expertise and arranged the fundings for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He had close ties to the Russian spy by the name of, a name that I can never pronounce these Russian names, Victor Lizovsky. Does that sound like a Russian name? Good enough. They'll never know. Nobody else ever know. I don't know why I even carry on. Yeah, that's what it was, definitely. Lizovsky. And this is what it says here in the particular book that I've been using, one of several books, by the way. It says that Levison had close ties to Russian spy Victor Lizovsky, reported in 1981 by the late Congressman John Ashbrook of Ohio, a longtime ranking member of the House Committee on Internal Security. Lizovsky was, until recently, the personal assistant to the Secretary General of the United Nations, and is one of the highest-ranking KGB officers ever to serve in the United States. His relationship with Levison shows that the advisor to King remained under KGB control even after leaving the Communist Party financial apparatus. Now, this comes from the Conservative Digest, an article by William P. Hoare. Bayard Rustin was an avowed homosexual and communist. He was the other man involved in forming the SCLC, and he drew up plans for the organization designed to coordinate civil rights activities in the South. Now, y'all remember Grandma's old adage, I'm sure, that birds of a feather flock together. And, you know, that's somewhat scriptural. The Bible talks in regards to the worthless men that would gather together and plot and etc. Ted, you want to know why I lose things? I've lost a book right here at the pulpit. Did someone sneak up here and take it? Isn't that something? Got it. Birds of a feather flock together. Now, here are some of King's advisors. This comes from the book Martin Luther King, the man behind the myth. Hunter Pitts Odell. Now, Odell was a member of the National Committee of the Communist Party. And this man went to work for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference late in 1960 as Dr. King's staff consultant. Here's another one. Well, we talked about Bayard Rustin being a communist and an avowed homosexual. He was the organizer, recruiter, and fundraiser for the Young Communist League and served 28 months in prison during World War II for refusing to do work required of those who were conscientious objectors. Fred Shuttleworth. He was a longtime field secretary of King's, and he was with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He was the president of that organization, he was the president of the Southern Conference Educational Fund. This group was thoroughly investigated by the committee of both the House and the Senate and repeatedly found to have major communist operations. On November 26, 1963, Shuttleworth was one of two honored guests at the 15th anniversary of the National Guardian, described by a congressional committee as a, quote, virtual official propaganda arm of Soviet Russia, end quote. This is what King said of Shuttleworth. He said, quote, Reverend Shuttleworth is my principal aide. Why he